The necklace burned. Celeste Vaughn pressed her fingers against the pendant at her throat. The small, obsidian dark stone set in silver so old that metal had taken on the color of moonlight, and she felt it pulse against her skin like a second heartbeat. It had done this before, this low, rhythmic throb, usually when she was stressed or tired or standing too close to something she did not understand. She had worn the piece every single day since her grandmother had pressed it into her palm at 17, whispering words in a language Celeste had never been able to identify. She had assumed it was a family heirloom, a sentimental thing, a pretty stone set in antique silver that her grandmother had treasured. She had not assumed it would bring a dying vampire king to her door. He stood in the entry hall of her grandfather's estate, and the word standing barely described what he was doing. He was holding himself upright through what appeared to be sheer, furious will. 6 feet and 3 inches of regal, ancient creature, white-haired with the kind of white that had never known youth, pale-skinned with the translucence of something that had not seen sunlight in decades, and possessed of a face so severe and beautiful it seemed carved rather than born. His eyes were the deep, arterial crimson of old blood, and they were fixed on her throat with an expression she had never seen on any face, human or otherwise. It was not hunger, it was recognition. "Where?" he said, and his voice was the low, fractured edge of something enormous trying not to collapse. "Did you get that?" Celeste did not step back. She had learned very young that stepping back only invited pursuit, and she had also learned that showing fear was the fastest way to lose whatever ground you were standing on. She kept her chin level and her eyes on his. "It belonged to my grandmother. Who are you, and how did you get past my security system?" One of the 2 figures flanking him, both vampires, both carrying themselves with the rigid posture of soldiers, shifted almost imperceptibly. The king, because that was clearly what he was, lifted one hand and they went perfectly still. He took a step forward and the effort of it showed in the slight tightening around his eyes, in the way he compensated for what appeared to be genuine physical pain. The vampire king was fading. She could see it now that she was looking. The pallor that was more than his kind's natural paleness. The tremor in the long fingers he had lowered back to his side. The dimming at the edges of those crimson eyes, as though the color itself were bleeding away. "My name," he said, "is Cassian Corvinus. I am the sovereign of the Noctis Court, the eldest crowned, and the last of the Corvinus bloodline, and that stone at your throat is the Anima Relic, stolen from my court 4 decades ago, and it is the only thing preventing my death." The silence that followed was the kind that rewrites everything. Celeste's fingers closed around the pendant. The pulse beneath it quickened. She had been 26 years old for exactly 3 weeks. She was the sole heir to the Vaughn estate and the Vaughn business empire, which meant she had spent the last 3 weeks managing lawyers, estate taxes, and distant relatives with hungry eyes. She had not been expecting to also manage a dying vampire king with a claim on her jewelry. "Then you should come in," she said, because she was, above all things, practical. "And you should sit down before you fall down. And then you are going to explain everything." The look he gave her in that moment, startled, assessing, recalibrated, told her that very few people had ever spoken to Cassian Corvinus that way. His soldiers looked like they might combust, but the king, after a long and searching pause, inclined his head. "As you wish," he said, and for the first time in what she would later learn, had been a very long and very terrible 40 years. Something in his expression softened, not much, but enough. It had begun, as most catastrophic things do, long before either of them was ready for it. 43 years prior, the Noctis Court had been a functioning empire. Not a metaphorical one. Cassian Corvinus ruled from a compound buried beneath 300 meters of limestone beneath the city of Vienna, a labyrinthine palace of black marble, vaulted ceilings, and blood law archives that stretched back to the 6th century. The court operated on a system of ancient covenants, alliances between vampire bloodlines that had been forged over centuries and maintained through protocol more rigid than any human government. There were blood laws governing territory, feeding, exposure, and the treatment of non-vampiric persons. There were vows so old they predated written language, and at the center of all of it, like a keystone in an arch, was the Anima Relic. The relic was not decorative. It was not symbolic. It was the physical anchor of Cassian's sovereignty, a stone formed from crystallized vampire essence during a ritual performed by his ancestor 700 years ago. The Corvinus line had always ruled the Noctis Court, and the relic was the reason. It was bound to the blood of the oldest living Corvinus heir, feeding power back into their body the way a heart feeds blood to organs. Without it, the body of the bonded ruler experienced a slow, irreversible drain, not a dramatic deterioration. Something more insidious, a gradual dimming, a leaching of strength, as if the vital essence of their immortality was slowly evaporating. It had taken 3 years for the effects to become noticeable. It had taken 10 for them to become alarming. It had taken 40 for them to reach what Cassian's physicians, in carefully neutral voices, called the terminal phase. The relic had been stolen by a vampire named Serafino Draculesti, a court noble with a centuries-old grudge against the Corvinus line, and a talent for patience that only the truly immortal could sustain. Serafino had arranged the theft with elegant precision, framing a young court attendant for the crime before vanishing into the human world with the stone. When they finally located Serafino, 3 years later, he was dead, drained by a rival, which was more common in vampire politics than anyone liked to admit. And the relic was nowhere to be found. What they had not known. What none of them had known until a Noctis Court intelligence operative caught the faintest trace of the relic's resonance signature 6 months ago. A signature that had been dormant because the stone had been sitting against warm human skin rather than worn by a vampire. Was that Serafino had hidden the relic not in a vault or a safe or a buried location, but in a human estate. He had it delivered, wrapped in an anonymous gift box with no card, to the home of a woman named Celeste Vaughn, a human historian who had spent decades documenting vampire-adjacent folklore. Whether he had intended it as irony, or had simply needed a hiding place that no one would think to check, they would never know. Miriam had worn the stone, and then she had given it to her granddaughter. Celeste absorbed all of this sitting across from Cassian Corvinus in her grandfather's study, with a fire going in the hearth and one of his soldiers. She had learned their names now, Ildren and Vasek, both ancient and thoroughly alarming. Standing at the study doors, and she did not interrupt once. She was good at that. Listening without performing a reaction. It drove her legal team insane. It appeared to interest Cassian considerably. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning the information over the way she turned over complex contracts, looking for the load-bearing points. "The relic needs to be returned to you," she said. "If I simply take it off and give it to you, does the bond restore itself?" He looked at her with those dimming crimson glance and eyes, and she watched something move through his expression that was difficult to categorize. "In theory," he said carefully, "the bond should begin re-establishing immediately, but I will not ask you to simply hand it over. Why not? You need it, I have it. The logical solution is, because the relic has been against your skin for 9 years, he said, and the quiet force in his voice was enough to make her stop. 9 years of continuous contact with a living human creates a secondary resonance. If it is removed too quickly, the withdrawal can cause significant harm to the human who has been carrying it. Your physicians would call it a neurological event. My physicians would call it a soul fracture. Either way, it is not something I will risk." Celeste stared at him. "You would rather continue fading than risk harming me?" Yes, the word was immediate, unequivocal. It sat in the air between them like something solid. She looked at him for a long moment. That is either deeply noble or deeply inconvenient. The ghost of something that might have been a smile moved across his face. Both, I suspect. The solution, as explained by Cassian's court physician, a vampire named Orvin, who arrived the following morning, looking like a very elegant coroner, was a process called gradual resonance transfer. Rather than a sudden removal, the relic would need to be acclimated to its bonded host over a period of time, while still in the presence of Celeste. Close proximity, sustained. Weeks, Orvin estimated, though the soul fracture risk diminished incrementally. The stone needed time to remember who it belonged to, which meant Cassian Corvinus needed to stay close to Celeste Vaughn. She had, in retrospect, expected him to fight this arrangement or find some workaround. What she had not expected was the way he settled into it. Not reluctantly, not like a man performing a duty, but with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who had suddenly found a reason to be very present in the moment. The Vaughn estate was large enough that housing a vampire king and two of his honor guard was not logistically catastrophic. The east wing had not been used in years, and its deep-set windows and stone walls suited the court's requirements. Celeste had the blackout panels her grandfather had installed for his rare sleeping disorder repurposed for the east wing's windows. She arranged feeding deliveries through a supplier she located with less difficulty than expected. The vampire world had infrastructure in the human world, she was learning, roots that ran deeper than most humans ever noticed. She was surprised, the first morning after they arrived, to find Cassian already in the library when she came down at 6. He was standing at the window, from the inside, in the room's low lamplight, because the morning sun was coming through, looking at the garden with an expression she could not immediately read. "Can you see it?" she asked. "The sun, I mean. Does it hurt even through the glass?" He turned to look at her. He was wearing a dark coat, and his white hair was loose, and in the low light of the library, he looked more like something painted than anything living. "No," he said. "The glass filters enough of the ultraviolet. I can see it without harm." A pause. "I simply find myself looking at things I have not allowed myself to look at recently." She poured herself a coffee from the carafe on the sideboard and leaned against the bookcase, studying him. "Because you thought you were dying." "Because I knew I was dying," he said it without self-pity, which made it land harder. There is a particular quality of attention that comes when you accept the end of something. You begin to notice what you will miss. "What do you miss?" He looked back at the garden. "Mornings, not standing in them. I have not stood in morning sunlight since I was turned 400 years ago, but watching them, the color of the sky, the way things look when the light is new." A pause. "I thought I had made my peace with losing that. When the fading began, I found I had not." Celeste wrapped both hands around her mug and felt the stone pulse against her sternum. "And now?" He turned to look at her again, and something in that look was quiet and honest and entirely unguarded for just a moment. "And now," he said, "I am sitting with the understanding that I was wrong, that there is still something worth staying for." The first week was careful, cautious. A process of two very different people learning the shape of each other's presence. Celeste managed the estate's business during the day. Her grandfather had built a significant investment portfolio that required active management, and she had also taken on the project of cataloging his personal library, which turned out to intersect with vampire history in ways that were becoming less surprising by the hour. She found 3 texts that Orvan confirmed were genuine blood law archives. She found an annotated volume that turned out to be a gift from a Noctis Court archivist to her grandfather, with a personal inscription in formal Old Vampiric that Cassian translated for her one evening without being asked. She had not asked him to translate it because she had not expected him to be in the library. He simply was. She was beginning to understand that this was how he operated. He did not announce himself or make a production of his presence, but he was there. Consistently, quietly, undeniably there. "Your grandfather knew about the court," she said, reading the translated inscription. "A gift of scholarship between two who understand the weight of ancient things. My respect and my gratitude, always." Warren Ashcroft, 1987. "He knew vampires were real. He knew considerably more than that," Cassian said. Harlan Vaughn was an Accord scholar, a human who had been formally recognized by the Noctis Court as a trusted liaison. It is a rare designation. We have given it perhaps a dozen times in 4 centuries. Celeste set down the book. "He never told me. He would have, I imagine, when he thought you were ready." A pause. "Or perhaps he assumed the relic would do the telling, eventually. He knew about the relic. It was not a question." "He was the one who contacted us when Serafino delivered it to your grandmother," Cassian said. "He told my court representative that he had the item in question and would keep it safe until we came for it. And then your grandmother died, and your grandfather fell ill, and he was not able to ensure what happened to it after his own death." Celeste pressed her fingers to the stone. Her grandfather had been dying for the last 2 years of his life, his mind going in slow degrees. He had not been able to tell her. He had not been able to prepare her for any of this. He had left her the estate and the weight of it and a necklace that turned out to be the anchor of an immortal king's life. "I wish he had found a way," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Cassian watched her. Then he did something she would not have predicted. He moved from the chair he had been occupying across the library and came to sit beside her at the reading table, close enough that she could feel the particular coolness that radiated from vampire skin, like sitting beside an open window in autumn. "He trusted you," Cassian said. "He trusted that when the time came, you would handle it as you have handled everything else he left you." With intelligence and steadiness and very few wasted words, she looked at him. "You've read my file." "I have read everything there is to know about everyone in the proximity of the relic," he said, unapologetically. "I am a king. I do not take risks with information. And what did you conclude?" "That Harlan Vaughn's granddaughter is considerably more formidable than the quiet life she appears to lead would suggest." She held his gaze for a moment. The fire was low, and in the library's half-dark his eyes were the color of garnets. Deep and lit from within, and the fading in them was still visible, the slight muddiness at the edges that should have been clear and vivid, but it was less pronounced than it had been 3 days ago. The proximity was working. Slowly, incrementally, the relic was beginning to remember him. "I'm going to need to learn the blood laws," she said. "If I'm going to be involved in this, and I clearly am, I should understand the rules I'm operating under." Something moved in his expression that she was learning to read as surprised approval. "You would be the first human in living memory to voluntarily undertake that study." "Well," she said, reaching for the annotated volume again. "My grandfather apparently thought the study was important enough to build a library around it. The least I can do is read the books." The danger came in the second week, arriving not as a dramatic confrontation but as information, which was almost always more frightening. Vasek, who ran the court's intelligence operations with the expressionless efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 2 centuries, brought the report to Cassian during dinner. Cassian did not eat, but he had developed the habit of sitting at the table when Celeste ate, which she had stopped finding strange and started finding comfortable, which should perhaps have been a signal, and set it before him without comment. Cassian read it in 3 seconds and went very still in the particular way that Celeste had learned meant he was controlling something considerable. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her across the table, and the answer in his eyes was careful. "Serafino Draculesti had a protégé," he said. "A vampire named Volkar. He has been aware for some time that the relic was in the human world. He has now apparently acquired more specific information about its location." Celeste set down her fork. "He's coming here!" "His people are already in the city. 3 operatives based on Vasek's intelligence. Volkar himself is likely to follow within the next 48 hours. A pause measured. "He does not want to return the relic to the court, he wants to use it. The relic, bonded as it currently is, carries resonance from both the Corvinus bloodline and your own life force. In the right ritual, that combination could theoretically be weaponized." "Weaponized how?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "Used to fracture the existing blood law bonds that hold the Noctis Court's alliances together. Think of it as a key that has been cut to open multiple locks simultaneously. With the relic in its current state, carrying your resonance alongside mine, someone who understood the old rituals could use it to dissolve the foundational covenants of the court, effectively dismantling 400 years of peace between bloodlines." Celeste was quiet for a moment, processing. "So the fact that I've been wearing it all these years has made it more dangerous than it was originally, and more valuable to those who wish the court harm." "Yes, then we need to accelerate the transfer." She reached up and touched the pendant. "If the relic finishes bonding to you, it loses the dual resonance and becomes useless to Volkar. Accelerating the transfer increases the risk to you, and leaving it as it is increases the risk to about 4 centuries of international vampire alliances and whatever stability they've been maintaining." "Celeste, walk me through Orvan's risk assessment," she said. "Not the cautious version, the actual numbers." There was a long silence. Cassian looked at her across the candlelit table with an expression that was fighting itself. Protectiveness warring with respect, and respect was winning, but it cost him something. "A full accelerated transfer in the current state of resonance has approximately a 30% chance of significant neurological harm," he said. "Headaches, disorientation, sensory disruption lasting weeks, and a smaller but non-negligible probability of something more serious, and the slow transfer if Volcar gets to me before it's complete. That is not a scenario I am willing to contemplate. Then contemplate the accelerated transfer, she said, because the math is fairly straightforward from where I'm sitting, and I'd rather have a headache than have the vampire equivalent of a nuclear weapon pointed at an entire political system, because I was being precious about my jewelry. He stared at her, and then he said, very quietly, "You are remarkable." She met his gaze. "I know. Talk to Orvin." What came next was not the accelerated transfer, because Orvin, consulted via secure channel, revised his risk estimate upward upon learning about the dual resonance. The soul fracture risk, in an accelerated process with a dual resonance relic, was not 30%. It was close to 60. Celeste did the math in her head and did not show the number on her face. But Cassian was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had lived 4 centuries learning to read people, and he saw it. "No," he said, in a tone that was not negotiable. I get to decline to participate in something that risks your life at 60% odds," he said. And his voice was controlled and absolute, and carrying something underneath it that was neither regal nor measured. "That is not a calculation I will accept." "Then what is your alternative? We fortify this estate. We move you to the inner rooms, the stone-walled section of the east wing, where the resonance interference from the estate's foundations provides some natural shielding. Vasek's team will establish a perimeter. Ildren and I will handle Volcar when he arrives." "You're still fading." "I am less faded than I was a week ago." He said it with something that was not quite pride and not quite stubbornness, but occupied the territory between them. "I am functional. I am more than capable of handling Volcar. He'll have backup, so will I." He held her gaze. "Trust me." It was the first time he had said those 2 words to her directly, and she was struck by how much weight they carried coming from him. Not a demand, not an assumption, a request. From a man who had spent 4 centuries being obeyed, who was asking rather than commanding, and whose eyes were doing something complicated that she was only beginning to know how to read. She said, "I trust you, but I want to be in the room, not locked away somewhere being protected. In the room." A muscle in his jaw moved. That is not Cassian. It was the first time she had used his name without a title, and she watched it land on him, watched his expression shift slightly in a way she filed away carefully. "I am the one wearing the relic. My resonance is in it. If Volcar is performing a ritual that requires my resonance, my presence is going to matter, and I would rather be present and useful than absent and still relevant to the outcome." He was quiet for a very long moment. "Stay behind me," he said finally. "That is not a negotiation point." She nodded once. "Behind you?" "Understood." He searched her face for something and apparently found it, because he exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that was more gesture than necessity for a creature that did not need air. And then he said, with the careful, quiet force of something he had not planned to say, "I will not let harm come to you. I want you to know that. Not as a matter of strategy, as a matter of..." He stopped. "As a matter of what?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "As a matter of considerable personal importance." The estate went into what Vasek called a code arrangement at midnight, which meant the perimeter was set. The outer doors were sealed with blood law wards that Ildren inscribed into the stone thresholds with practiced precision, and Celeste moved her operational base to the east wing's inner study, which was indeed stone-walled, and which had the additionally reassuring quality of having no exterior-facing windows. She did not sleep. She sat at the desk with a blood law primer Cassian had provided, a slim volume that managed to be both archaic and brutally logical, and she read, and she thought about the weight of the pendant against her skin, and she thought about crimson eyes that were very slowly brightening, and she thought about a man who had lived 4 centuries and still looked at morning gardens through saal windows as though they were precious. Cassian came to the doorway at 2 in the morning and stood there for a moment looking at her. "You should rest," he said. "I won't be able to." She set down the primer. "How long do you think we have?" "Vasek reports movement on the north perimeter. I expect Volcar will move at dawn. It is a tactically sound choice when dealing with vampires, because it forces us indoors. He's vampire. Why would he move at dawn? Volcar is of the Drakaleshti bloodline, which has an anomalous daylight adaptation. Not immunity, he cannot sustain it for long, but enough. 20–30 minutes in direct light before he begins to burn. It is the bloodline's only genuine tactical advantage. A pause. Serafino had the same adaptation. It is how he managed certain operations during his time. Celeste absorbed this, so he'll come with that window, fast, while we're inside. Yes. Which is why I need to meet him before he reaches the building. He paused. Celeste, I want to say something, and I need you to hear it clearly. She looked up at him fully. If something goes wrong, he said, if Volcar reaches you, before we can stop him, do not let him take the relic. He cannot force the resonance transfer through simple contact. It requires your cooperation or your incapacitation, so do not be incapacitated. His voice was measured, but what was moving behind his eyes was not. Stay conscious. Stay difficult. You are very good at both. That's almost a compliment, she said. It is entirely a compliment. He crossed the room in a few measured strides and crouched before her chair, so that he was at her eye level, which no one who understood what he was would ever expect him to do, and his voice dropped in register. I have been alive for 400 years. I have negotiated treaties between bloodlines that despised each other. I have survived coups, betrayals, and the particular loneliness of outliving everyone I have ever trusted. He paused. I did not expect to find something worth surviving for on the other side of this. Celeste's breath caught in her chest. Cassian, when this is over, he said, I would like to have a conversation about what comes after, not the relic, not the court, you and I. He held her gaze with the steady force of someone who had learned 4 centuries ago. That time was not infinite even for the immortal, and who had apparently decided to stop wasting it. Would you be willing to have that conversation? She looked at him in the amber lamplight of the stone study, and she felt the pendant pulse steadily between them like a heartbeat marking time, and she said, yes. He rose, and then, because he was apparently a man who did nothing halfway, he lifted her hand from the arm of the chair and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Old world, formal and entirely sincere. Then I have excellent motivation, he said, to resolve the current situation promptly. She watched him go and pressed her fingers to the warm stone at her throat and smiled into the empty room. Volcar Draculeshti arrived at first light. He did not come quietly. He came with 7 vampires, all from fringe bloodlines, who had been feeding resentments against the Noctis Court for decades. And he came with the particular arrogance of someone who had been planning a long time and believed the plan was airtight. The Bloodlaw wards on the threshold stopped 4 of his 7. The wards were binding on any vampire who had not been granted express entry, and 4 of Volcar's people hit the invisible boundary and were thrown back into the grey morning light with enough force to crack the stone of the outer steps. Ildren, stationed at the secondary entrance, handled one more with an efficiency that Celeste, watching on the estate's security monitors from the inner study, decided not to examine too closely. That left 2 with Volcar. Cassian met them in the entrance hall. Celeste watched the monitor, and her heart did something it had no business doing, which was lodge itself in her throat and stay there. Cassian was taller than Volcar by several inches, and even in the diminished state of 40 years of fading, the difference in presence was visible. Volcar was lean and fair, with a cold, calculated elegance that reminded Celeste of corporate lawyers who had learned to weaponize pleasantness. Cassian was not pleasant. Cassian was what 4 centuries of sovereign authority looked like when it stopped being patient. Corvinus, Volcar said, and his voice carried through the audio feed with the smooth affect of someone performing confidence. You look terrible. You look like someone who made a very poor strategic decision, Cassian said. I came for what Serafino hid. The court has no right to a weapon that powerful. You have always hoarded that which could balance the bloodlines. I am simply correcting the arrangement. The relic is not a weapon, it is a sovereign bond, and you are standing in my territory under a bloodlaw violation of the 3rd category, which gives me the right to end this conversation right now. Volcar's pleasant effect cracked along the edges. The girl is here. I can sense the dual resonance from here. She is within this building. Give her to me, and I will leave the court intact. Something in the air changed. It was not a visible thing, but Celeste saw it on the monitor, saw it in the way Cassian's posture shifted, the way his chin dropped fractionally and his eyes came forward, And even through the small screen, she understood that she was watching something very old and very dangerous wake up completely. "Say that again," Cassie said, with a quietness that was worse than shouting. Volcar seemed to recalibrate. "The girl, her name is Celeste Vaughn. She is under my protection, formally and personally, and the next words you say about her will determine whether I remember that I am a sovereign bound by blood law, or whether I forget, very briefly, that I am supposed to be restrained." Silence, then Volcar lunged. It was fast, vampire fast, the kind of speed that made human eyes struggle to track, and the two vampires with him moved simultaneously from different angles. Celeste's hand pressed flat over the pendant, and she was already calculating, already moving, because there were three of them, and she had watched the layout of the entrance hall, and she understood, with the cold clarity that she defaulted to under pressure, that Cassian was strong but still not at full strength, and the numbers were going to matter. She was already in the corridor, outside the study, before she fully decided to move. Not toward the entrance hall, that much she honored, but toward the side passage that led to the estate's old panic room, where her grandfather, who apparently had known considerably more than she'd realized, had installed something Celeste had found during the estate inventory and catalogued as antique equipment without understanding what it was. She understood it now. A blood law amplifier, a device that boosted the resonance of active ward bindings, designed to reinforce sovereign bonds in a crisis. If she activated it while wearing the relic, the dual resonance would flood the ward network. It might hurt her. Orvin had not specifically addressed this scenario, because Orvin had not known about the amplifier, but it would also seal every blood law ward in the estate to maximum binding strength, which would drop Volcar's companions through the floor of their legal standing so completely that even the fringe bloodlines would have to honor it. She was aware this was not staying behind Cassian. She was also aware that Cassian was fighting three opponents in a fading state, and that she had a means of ending it, and that doing nothing was not actually safer than doing something. The panic room was 30 seconds away. She moved. The amplifier looked like a lamp base, heavy and black, and it had a central socket that corresponded exactly to the pendant setting. She had thought it was decorative, now understood it was a charging cradle, a resonance anchor specifically shaped for the relic. Her hand was steady when she pressed the pendant into the socket. She did not take it off. She could not take it off without the soul fracture risk. But she could press it into contact with the amplifier while still wearing it, completing the circuit through her own body, letting the resonance flow through her like a current through a wire. It felt like being struck by lightning that had opinions. The pain was immediate and bright and extraordinary. A full-body shockwave that knocked her back against the wall and then held her there, and the world went white at the edges, and she heard, truly heard, with the full resonance of 400 years of sovereign bond. The blood law wards of the estate activate to their absolute maximum strength. In the entrance hall, Volcar Dracolechti hit the floor. Both of his companions hit the floor simultaneously, a binding so complete it was almost visible, the ancient covenants slamming down like iron gates. Volcar, who had a daylight adaptation but no ward adaptation, experienced what the blood law called a sovereign suppression, a total removal of agency within the bounded space. He could not stand, he could not speak, he could not do anything but lie there and understand, with the full clarity of vampire consciousness, that he had just discovered why you did not come for the Anima relic while it was in the hands of someone who had read the blood law primer, Cassian, who was neither Volcar nor one of his people, and who had been operating under a blood law exception as the relic's bonded heir, felt the ward activation as an enormous, crashing wave of returned strength. His body had not experienced full sovereign bond resonance in 40 years. It hit him like a tide coming in. He stood in the entrance hall with three incapacitated opponents around him, and the blood law wards, burning gold in the stone beneath his feet, and felt, for the first time in 4 decades, completely himself. And then he felt, through the resonance of the relic, something sharp and distressed from the direction of the east wing, and he was moving before he fully processed it. He found her in the panic room, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her hand still pressed to the pendant, and her face white and damp, and her eyes. Her eyes were open and steady, which was the only reason he did not do something completely disproportionate. She was conscious. She was present. She was wincing with the precise expression of someone trying not to show how much pain they were in. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and crouched before her, and she looked up at him, and something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile, but had the shape of one. "You're at full strength," she said. Her voice was slightly rough. "I can tell. You look completely different." His eyes were full crimson again, vivid and clear and burning with the restored vitality of a sovereign bond completed. The pallor of the fading was gone. He looked like what he was, ancient and powerful and utterly, devastatingly present, and he was looking at her with an expression that had completely abandoned any performance of regal composure. "How badly are you hurt?" he said. "I'm fine. It's manageable." At his expression, it was a neurological event. "I have a headache that is significant. My vision is doing something interesting at the edges. But I'm coherent, and I can feel my extremities, so I'm calling it a success." "You went to the amplifier." His voice was controlled, but only technically. "You went through the panic room. I told you to stay behind you. I stayed behind you. I stayed considerably behind you, all the way in the panic room, which is behind the entire rest of the building from where you were." She held his gaze. "You were outnumbered and fading. I had a means of ending it without anyone dying. I used it. That is not defiance. That is the application of available resources." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You could have been killed. I wasn't. The probability was lower than the probability of continuing to let you fight 3 opponents when you hadn't been at full strength in 4 decades. She watched his jaw move. "I calculated it. You know I calculated it. You know exactly what kind of person I am by now." A muscle in his face moved. "Yes," he said after a beat. "I do." He reached out and took her face in both his hands, which were cool and careful and steady, and he looked at her with the full, unmediated attention of someone who had stopped caring about restraint. "I know exactly what kind of person you are, and I find it." He paused. "Infuriating," he said, "and extraordinary, in that order and simultaneously." "That might be the most accurate description of me I've ever heard," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and the cool, smooth press of his skin against hers was gentle in the way that very strong things can be gentle when they choose to be. "Don't do that again," he said. "I won't need to," she said, "because you're going to be at full strength from now on." He stayed like that for a moment, a very long moment by any standard, and then he lifted his head and looked at her, and what was in his face was something she recognized, because she had been feeling the shape of it herself for the last 2 weeks. It was not convenient. It was not logical. It was the specific, inevitable thing that happens when 2 people with exceptional levels of personal stubbornness and mutual respect spend 2 weeks in close proximity during a crisis and discover that they have become profoundly, problematically necessary to each other. "We still have a conversation we agreed to have," he said. "We do," she said, "after I get some ibuprofen." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. It was low and warm and surprised, as if it had caught him off guard, and she thought it might be the best thing she had ever heard. Volkar and his 2 remaining operatives were dealt with through the blood law system, which, Celeste was discovering, was far more comprehensive and enforceable than any human legal apparatus she had encountered. Vasek filed the sovereign suppression report within the hour. 2 senior court advocates arrived from Vienna by evening. The fringe bloodlines that had backed Volkar's operation found themselves facing covenant penalties that went back decades, which was the blood law equivalent of a class action lawsuit being prosecuted by someone who had literally centuries of precedent on their side. Volkar himself was remanded to a bloodline tribunal, which Cassian, as the sovereign, did not preside over directly but did attend, standing at the back of the chamber beneath Vienna, with his arms folded and his eyes clear and vivid, and all of the restored force of his sovereignty visible in the way he occupied the room. Several of the tribunal members seemed unable to look directly at him for too long, which reminded Celeste of trying to look at the sun. She sat beside him. She had come to Vienna with him. She had not asked. She had simply been there when Vasek outlined the travel arrangements, and Cassian had looked at her and said nothing, which she had correctly interpreted as agreement. She was wearing the pendant, still. The transfer was still in progress. She suspected she would be wearing it for some weeks yet, and she found she did not mind. The court beneath Vienna was exactly as extraordinary as she had imagined. Black marble and vaulted stone, and blood law archives that lined entire corridors, and rooms where the walls were carved with the sigils of 700 years of covenant bonds, and a deep, profound sense of something ancient and functional. A civilization built from patience and necessity, and the peculiar creativity of minds that had centuries in which to work. Cassian gave her a tour, which was not something she had been expecting. He was formal and precise and thorough, and about halfway through the Eastern Archive wing, she said, "You love this place," and he stopped walking and looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. "It is mine. I built most of it, over several centuries. 400 years of work, approximately, with assistance." He paused. "It has not always been simple work. The bloodlines do not agree easily. There are old grievances that date back to before I was turned, and there are new ones created every decade, and the work of maintaining any kind of peace between them is—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Exhausting," she offered. "Consuming," she said, "but worthwhile. I believe it is worthwhile." He looked at the carved walls, the sigils. 40 years of fading has a way of making you question whether you have spent your centuries on something that will last. Whether the thing you have built is solid, or whether it is all held together by your presence, and will simply unravel when you are gone. "And what have you concluded?" He looked at her. "That I was building towards something I had not yet identified, and that I am now beginning to understand what it was." She held his gaze in the archive corridor, with the blood-law sigils glowing faintly in the low light, and she said, "Are you going to make me ask?" "No," he said, and crossed the distance between them and kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have been circling something inevitable for long enough that when they finally arrive at it, there is no hesitation. His hands came to her face with the same careful, deliberate grace he applied to everything, and the cool precision of his touch was overwhelmingly gentle, and she pressed her hand flat over the pendant between them and felt it pulse like a living thing celebrating itself. And she kissed him back with the full conviction of someone who had looked at the available evidence and reached a very clear conclusion. When they finally separated, he kept his hands against her face and looked at her with those vivid, restored, impossible eyes, and she said, slightly breathlessly, "The Relic is very happy about this." He laughed again, and she filed it away in the same place she was keeping all the other rare, extraordinary things about him. "It has a resonance response to sovereign bonds," he said. "I imagine a sovereign choosing a person might qualify." "Is that what you're doing?" she asked. "Choosing a person?" He was quiet for a moment, with the thoughtful weight of someone being precise. "I have spent 4 centuries watching the bloodlines negotiate the terms of their alliances," he said.
Yeah.
"I have written blood law covenants that govern territory, feeding, and the treatment of every category of individual my world intersects with. I have been very thorough about rules and their purpose." A pause. "I have never applied any of that thoroughness to myself, to what I might want, separate from what the court requires. And now I am looking at you in my archive corridor and understanding that what I want is to have many more conversations and continue to be infuriated and occasionally terrified by your complete inability to stay where I put you." He said it with complete seriousness, and the slight warmth behind his eyes that she had learned was what amusement looked like on a face that had spent centuries practicing composure. "And I would like to do so with the full, formal intention of keeping you." Celeste considered him. The black marble walls, the ancient sigils, the pale, beautiful, extraordinary man standing in the heart of a 400-year-old civilization he had built, looking at her like she was the thing that made it coherent. "I would like that too," she said. Orvan completed the resonance transfer assessment 3 weeks later, in Vienna, in the court's medical wing, a room that was significantly less medieval than the rest of the facility, and considerably more equipped than any human hospital she had seen. The dual resonance in the Relic had fully separated. Cassian's bond was restored to its complete original state. Her own resonance had disengaged cleanly, which Orvan attributed to the careful pacing and the blood law amplifier process, which had apparently served as an accelerant that was, unlike a direct air removal, mediated through the ward system rather than her nervous system directly. The headache should resolve completely within the month, Orvin said, with the clinical satisfaction of someone who had been genuinely worried about this outcome and was relieved not to have had to explain a soul fracture to the king. The stone is free to be removed at any point without risk to either party. Celeste reached up and unclasped the necklace for the first time in 9 years. The absence of its weight was startling, like removing a layer of something you had forgotten you were carrying. She turned it over in her hand, the obsidian dark stone in its silver setting, antique and quiet and still and entirely ordinary looking. She held it out to Cassian. He took it from her palm, and as the stone touched his skin, it pulsed once, vivid and strong, a single deep throb of recognition, and then settled. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened they were burning with the full, clear crimson of complete sovereign bond. No muddiness, no edges. The fading was gone entirely, not just diminished, but erased as thoroughly as if it had never been. He looked at the stone in his hand. Then he looked at her. 9 years, she said quietly. I carried it 9 years without knowing. You kept me alive, he said, without knowing. He closed his hand gently around the stone. Your grandmother kept me alive first. Your grandfather held it for me when he could. And then you. A pause. There is a blood law concept called the Varanthi bond, a bond between a vampire and a human who has preserved their sovereign essence. It is extraordinarily rare. It has not been invoked in over 2 centuries. What does it mean? It means the human in question is formally recognized by the court as equivalent in standing to a blood law noble. It means they are under the protection of every covenant the Noctis Court has ever signed. It means, he paused, and something moved through his expression that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. It means you belong to the court as fully as the court belongs to you if you wish it. Celeste looked at him. At the gravity and the hope, both present in equal, careful measure, in the face of someone who had been alive for 4 centuries and still looked like he was waiting for an answer he was not certain of. Does the Varanthi bond require me to live underground? She asked. No. You may live however and wherever you choose. The bond is a status, not a location. Does it require me to stop managing my grandfather's estate and portfolio? Absolutely not. The court's own investment infrastructure is in significant need of human world management expertise if you were ever interested. The faintest suggestion of something dry in his voice. Voluntarily. Does it require me to be somewhere in the same general arrangement as you? He looked at her. Only if you want to be. She smiled. Then I accept the Varanthi bond. The formal ceremony was small. Celeste had expected something theatrical and found instead something ancient and precise and surprisingly intimate, performed in the archive corridor where they had first kissed. Because Cassian had chosen the location and had refused to explain why until she realized why, and then she had looked at him and he had looked back at her with that composed expression and the warmth behind it. And she had decided not to say a thing because the gesture was complete without commentary. The blood law advocate inscribed the bond record into the archive wall alongside 700 years of covenant history. Vasek and Ildren served as witnesses. Orvin looked quietly relieved that no one was in medical distress. When it was complete, Cassian held out the relic to her. She looked at it. That belongs to you. The stone belongs to the sovereign bond, he said. Which is mine. You belong, by the Varanthi, to the court. The pendant setting belonged to your grandmother, and now to you. He met her eyes. Orvin tells me that wearing the stone again, now that the dual resonance has cleared, would carry only what he calls a passive harmonic, a residual connection, nothing that would affect your health. He paused. But I would like you to have the choice. She took the pendant from him and turned it over in her hand. The stone was quiescent now, calm and dark, without the urgent pulse it had carried for 9 years. She had lived without its weight for 3 weeks and found she missed it in a way that had nothing to do with what it actually was. She clasped it back around her throat. It settled against her skin with the familiar warmth of something returning home, and pulsed once, soft and quiet and entirely different from the frantic beat it had maintained through the Volcar confrontation. Steady, content, a rhythm like a heart at rest. Cassian watched it settle. Then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and there in the archive corridor, with the blood law sigils ancient and patient on the walls around them, something between them simply completed itself. So, she said. Tell me how the Noctis Court investment infrastructure actually works. Because I spent 6 hours with your accounting records last night, and there are at least 3 significant inefficiencies that You read our accounting records, he said. Vasek gave me access. I assumed it was authorized. He was not authorized to give you access. Are you going to revoke the access? He looked at her for a long, measured moment. No, he said. Tell me what you found. She smiled, and he smiled back, and they walked deeper into the archive together, talking, and the bloodlaw sigils on the walls glowed with the quiet, indifferent permanence of things written to last. The months that followed were, by any measure, extraordinary. Celeste maintained the Vaughn estate, which she was now also discovering had a considerably deeper history with the Noctis Court than she had initially realized, her grandfather having served as an unofficial financial advisor to the court's Human World holdings for nearly 2 decades. She installed proper fiber infrastructure in the East Wing, which made Ildren deeply suspicious, and Cassian quietly amused. She spent 3 weeks cataloguing the full extent of the court's above-ground property interests, which were sprawling and underleveraged, and produced a 40-page restructuring proposal that Cassian read in its entirety, and then looked at her over with the expression she had come to love, which was the expression of someone thoroughly impressed and thoroughly unwilling to be completely obvious about it. He approved 11 of her 14 recommendations immediately. The remaining 3, he noted, required Bloodline Council approval because they touched on Covenant-adjacent assets. Then let's bring it to the Council, she said. You would like to present to the full Bloodline Council of the Noctis Court. I would like the restructuring to proceed efficiently, and the Council is the deciding body. So yes. He studied her. You understand that this Council includes representatives of bloodlines that have been negotiating antagonistically for 3 centuries. I've dealt with competing family interests in estate law, she said. How much worse can it be? The answer, she discovered, was somewhat worse, but not unmanageable. The council meeting was held in the full formal chamber of the Vienna court, a room that was every bit as overwhelming as she had prepared herself for. Black marble columns, a vaulted ceiling painted with the cartography of 7 centuries of covenant bonds, 8 bloodline representatives, who looked at her with varying degrees of calculated assessment. She was human. She was young by their standards. She was the sovereign's chosen person, and the Varanthi bond meant they were legally obligated to treat her with the standing of a bloodlaw noble. They were scrupulously correct, and deeply, thoroughly curious. She presented for 40 minutes. She had prepared for every objection she could anticipate, based on the bloodlaw primer and 2 months of additional study, and she fielded each question with the flat precision of someone who had inherited, along with the estate and the portfolio, a complete absence of intimidation when it came to rooms full of powerful people. Cassian sat at the council table and did not say a single word during the presentation. He did not need to. His presence said everything his position required. What his face said to anyone who knew how to read it was something considerably more personal. The council approved all 3 remaining recommendations by a 5-3 margin, which Vasek told her afterward was a more decisive outcome than most proposals received even from the sovereign himself. The Marankov bloodline alone usually blocks everything on principle, Vasek said, with the tone of someone sharing information they found mildly astounding. I had a 20-minute conversation with Representative Marankov before the meeting, Celeste said. We found common ground on the liquidity management issue. Vasek looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as the highest form of regard his particular disposition was capable of, which manifested as a very slight elevation of one eyebrow. I see, he said. And then he went back to his work, which she understood was his equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening, Cassian found her in the archive corridor, which had become their place in the way that particular spaces become particular between people, not by decision but by repetition, by the accumulation of honest conversations and small revelations and moments that gradually add up to something that looks from the outside like a home. You were extraordinary today, he said. I was prepared, she corrected. You were both. He stood with her in the low archive light and looked at the walls, the ancient records, the 400 years of covenants she had been reading her way through. The court has not had this kind of energy in a very long time, he said. Things have been correct, procedurally sound, maintained. But there has not been movement, progress. The sense that what we are building is growing towards something rather than simply persisting. That's what happens when systems become too internally focused, she said. They optimize for their own survival and lose track of what they were surviving for. He looked at her with those vivid, clear eyes. And what should we be surviving for, she considered. Continuation, she said. Not just of the bloodlines or the covenants, but of the work. The actual reasons for the work, which, as far as I can tell from the archives, was originally about preventing the kind of bloodline warfare that killed half of Europe in the 12th century, and creating a sustainable system for coexistence. That's still a worthwhile project. It is. He was quiet for a moment. I have spent 400 years maintaining that project. I have not until recently considered that I might want to share the building of it with someone. She turned to look at him. Is that what we're doing? I believe so. With your permission. He said it with the gravity of someone for whom words of this weight were neither casual nor unconsidered. I am aware that what I am asking you to consider is not a simple thing. I am immortal. You are not. That is a reality that does not have an elegant resolution. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully in the way she thought about everything that mattered, turned it over until she had seen every face of it. The blood law has protocols for the Varanthi bond's long-term continuation, she said. Orvin explained the options when he filed the bond record. I read the documentation. Cassian was very still. You read the long-term continuation protocols. I read everything relevant to my situation. You know this about me. She held his gaze. There are options. Some are complex. Some require choices I can't make alone. But none of them are impossible. A pause. I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I'm telling you that I've looked at the problem. I know the shape of it, and I am not afraid of it. He looked at her for a long, long moment. Do you know, he said very quietly, that in 4 centuries I have never met anyone who approached life the way you do. With spreadsheets. With complete, fearless clarity. He moved toward her and took her face in his hands with the gentle, deliberate care that never failed to undo something in her chest. With the willingness to look at the hardest things and choose to stay anyway. That's what you do, she said. You've been doing it for 400 years. Not with anyone beside me. No, she agreed. Not with anyone beside you. She placed her hands over his. But that's changing. He kissed her in the archive corridor, and the blood law sigils glowed on the walls around them. And the pendant pulsed its steady, quiet pulse between them. And the thing between them that had been growing, since the night he stood in her grandfather's entry hall, and looked at her with recognition and exhaustion, and something that turned out to be the beginning of everything. That thing was complete. Not finished. Complete. There is a difference, and it is the difference between an ending and a beginning that has finally arrived at itself. The Noctis Court's Winter Assembly, a formal gathering held every decade at the full Vienna compound, drawing representatives from every blood on 3 continents, fell 4 months after the Volcar incident, and it was the first assembly in 40 years to be presided over by a sovereign at full strength. The difference was visible in ways that went beyond the obvious. The court had been running on maintained protocol, and Cassian's considerable force of will during the decades of fading, and both had been sufficient. But there is a particular quality of gravity that a sovereign at full bond generates, a deep hum in the blood law resonance of the entire compound, and every vampire present could feel it. The assembly convened with a stillness that Vasek, in a rare offering of personal observation, described as the quietest opening he had ever witnessed. Cassian opened the assembly with the formal sovereign declaration, which was a blood law document recited from memory, from memory that formally renewed all active covenants and established the sovereign's fitness to govern for the subsequent decade. He delivered it with complete precision, standing in the full chamber with 800 years of combined bloodline experience in the room around him, and when the declaration was complete and the resonance hum in the walls rose in response, the entire chamber was briefly, absolutely silent. Then he said in the same formal register, but with a shift in cadence that everyone present understood was intentional. This assembly will also formally acknowledge the Varanthi bond established between the Noctis Court and Celeste Vaughn, a Court scholar designate and sovereign companion, whose stewardship of the anima relic during the period of its absence from the court contributed directly to the preservation of this sovereign line. Celeste, seated in the observers section that had been, by very specific arrangement, given the formal placement of a bloodline representative, lifted her chin and let them look. They looked, all of them. 800 years of accumulated opinion and pride and political calculation, examining the human woman in the antique dark dress, who had worn the vampire king's life around her throat for 9 years without knowing it, and who had sealed 3 vampires to the floor with a blood law amplifier rather than wait to be rescued, and who had apparently reorganized the court's investment portfolio in her spare time. The Marenkov representative was the first to formally incline her head. It was a significant gesture, and the room understood it as such. The others followed, in the order their protocol dictated, until the acknowledgement was complete. After the assembly, in the long corridor outside the formal chamber, Ildren, who expressed himself primarily through the quality of his silences, stood beside Celeste for a moment and said, in his deep and infrequent voice, "You did well." She looked at him. "Was there doubt?" he considered. "No," he said, and walked away. She laughed quietly to herself and looked up to find Cassian crossing the corridor toward her with the focused, unhurried movement of someone who has stopped pretending they are not moving toward a specific destination. "The assembly has gone better than projected," he said. "The assembly has gone exactly as projected," she said. "I ran the numbers, of course you did." He reached her and stopped, close enough that the ambient cool of him settled against her warmth in the way it always did. That specific difference that she had come to find not strange, but deeply, essentially reassuring. He looked at her with the full, clear attention that still sometimes made her breath catch, in a way she would not entirely admit to. "Celeste, yes. I would like to discuss the long-term continuation protocols you mentioned in the archive." She felt her heart do the thing it did. "Now, when you're ready," he said. "I don't want to rush any decision of that magnitude, but I find that I am motivated to understand the timeline you're considering. Because 4 centuries has taught me very thoroughly that time is not infinite, even when it appears to be, and I have spent enough of it in the wrong direction." She looked at him in the corridor outside the formal chamber, with the deep carved walls of the ancient court around them, and the sounds of 800 years of vampire history continuing in the rooms nearby, and she understood with the clean, absolute clarity that she trusted above all other faculties, that this was the right thing and the right person and the right time to say yes. "I've been thinking about the resonance and chord extension method," she said. Orvin mentioned it carries some risk in the transition period, but no long-term complications. I'd want to review the full medical record and have Orvin walk me through the process in detail. And I'd want at least 3 months to consider it fully, because I don't make major decisions quickly. 3 months, he said. That is perfectly reasonable. And I'd want it on the table that the decision is mine, not the court's, not the protocols, mine. There is no version of this where it is anything other than yours, he said immediately. That is not negotiable in the other direction. She nodded. Then let's have that conversation. Thoroughly, when there's time. There will be time, he said. We have, I suspect, a considerable amount of it. She looked at him and thought about her grandmother, who had worn this stone, and loved a historian who had known about vampires and kept their secrets and tried, in a quiet and ultimately incomplete way, to prepare his granddaughter for the weight she would inherit. She thought about the thread of it, the chain of unknowing and keeping and trust that had run from that first delivery of a hidden relic to a human estate all the way to this moment, this corridor, this man with the ancient eyes and the restored sovereignty, and the careful, honest way he loved her. She reached up and touched the pendant. It pulsed, warm and steady, as it always did, and she understood now that it had been pulsing that way for 9 years, not because of stress or proximity to the unknown, but because it had been doing what it was made to do. Anchoring something, keeping something alive, marking the bond between two things that belonged, however strangely, however slowly to each other. Okay, she said. 4 centuries from now, when I ask you what this moment felt like, What are you going to tell me? He was quiet for exactly 1 second, and then he said, with complete sincerity and the faint warmth in his eyes that was her very favorite thing about a face she had come to know, the way you know the view from a window you have looked out of every morning, like the end of fading, like everything coming back to full clarity. A pause. Like you. She took his hand, and they walked together back into the light of the ancient court, and the bloodline assembly continued around them. And the Bloodlaw archives held their 700 years of covenants, and the pendant rested steady and content at her throat. And ahead of them were all the conversations and all the work, and all the mornings they would watch through glass, and all the rooms they would argue about, and the councils they would address, and the long, luminous arc of a life built between two people who had been moving toward each other for longer than either of them had known. The anima relic pulsed once more, deep and certain, and then it simply rested, as living things do when they are finally completely home.